Your city station presents Mrs. John W. Castles, Jr. in a Civilian Defense Volunteer Office program, News and Letters from Home and Abroad. Mrs. Castles.
Good morning, radio friends. The San Francisco Conference is opened. Opened to plan the machinery for a world peace. Opened in a country at war, and yet, except for grief, untouched by war. In other parts of the world, men are fighting and dying for the principles of freedom and justice, which must be the keystone of the peace to come. Our hearts are with these fighting men, but our hearts are also with the men in San Francisco, who are charged with such immense responsibility.
You know, Mrs. Castles, I wish more than our hearts could be with these men in San Francisco. I mean, I wish there was something we could do, some part we could play in sharing their tremendous responsibilities.
We can, Mr. Child. Each one of us who reads, each one of us who hear, have an immeasurable responsibility, an individual one, but one in which, in the end, will determine the framework of the whole.
Well, just what do you mean by that? What we think, people like us, isn't going to affect what is decided in San Francisco, is it?
Oh, yes, it is, Mr. Child. Because wars are reported to be run by generals, because domestic problems are reported to be settled by our leaders, we have come to think that we, as individuals, don't count. That isn't true.
Well, perhaps not, Mrs. Castles. But I still feel that we, as individuals, can't do too very much. What makes you think we can? Before you answer, I want to say again that I wish with all my heart that every one of us could do something to share the responsibility that lies on the world today.
I know, Mr. Child. I rather think we all feel the same way. We've all been vitally interested in a world organization for world peace. We've had all sorts of opportunities to read and hear about the original proposals made last October at Dumbarton Oaks. Some of us have paid attention, a few of us haven't. Some of us have understood them, many of us have been confused. Nevertheless, we've all had the opportunity to read and study and discuss these proposals.
And you think whatever conclusions we come to will affect the final result?
Assuredly, yes. For under the form of government which administers our country, we cannot commit ourselves, nor be committed, until the legislative branch of government has voted approval of commitments. Who elects our legislators?
We do.
Well then, Mr. Child, isn't it pretty important for us to know about an international organization for world peace? And knowing and believing intelligently in the need for such an organization, isn't it also pretty important for us to convey to our legislators our support of such an instrument? If our congressmen felt that we, the people of this country, were wholly opposed to such an enterprise, do you think for 1 minute that they would commit the United States to partnership?
No, of course not. I'd not thought of it in quite this way, but I see now that what we think and feel on this world-important subject does have a direct bearing.
Mr. Child, by eavesdropping on some people who have realized the necessity of understanding the purpose of the San Francisco Conference, and listening to their discussions, we've learned a lot. There's still a great deal more these people are trying to understand. Shall we listen to them again?
By all means, Mrs. Castles. I found the discussions have helped me clear my own thinking.
Yes, I've found the same thing. They're talking now. Let's listen.
Dumbarton Oaks. A cigarette box is the General Assembly, only it hasn't any members in it because I haven't any cigarettes.
Margaret, what on earth are you doing?
My lessons, Phil. Look, each box on the table is a committee.
Mad. Completely mad.
Wait a minute, Phil. I think Margaret's got a pretty smart idea there.
See?
Hello, Duncan. I didn't hear you come in. The others here?
They're right behind. Here they are now.
Hello, Alice. Hello, everybody. Sit down and be comfortable.
Is that big pot full of coffee, Margaret?
Something tells me we're going to need it tonight, Margaret. I'm not sure I've got everything straight yet.
I know I haven't, Alice. 1 minute I think I have, and the next minute I'm all mixed up again. At least it seems so.
Well, there's lots of coffee to sharpen our wits whenever we want it.
Margaret, what have you got all those boxes on the table for?
She's made up a new game, George.
Dumbarton Oaks, they're committees.
What are committees, Margaret?
The boxes, Alice.
Oh.
Margaret, dear, are you sure you're feeling well?
Oh, perfectly well, Janet. Look, I'll explain. This big box is the General Assembly. The smallest matchbox is the Security Council.
Wait a minute, Margaret. You've got that one in the wrong place.
What do you mean, Duncan?
Well, because the line of authority goes directly this way, see? I think this is a swell idea. It makes us sort of see it for ourselves.
See?
I tell you what, let's ask some questions and really see how much we know. Now take this big box.
That's the General Assembly. All right? Somebody ask a question.
Well, who belongs to the General Assembly?
I know.
Well, who?
The members.
Oh, Margaret.
Wait a minute. I think I know. The United Nations.
Well, that's right, but who else can join?
Well, any peace-loving nation. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. What's the voting arrangement in the General Assembly?
Well, on all major questions, it must be 2/3 of the majority vote. But on less important questions, a straight majority vote is sufficient.
Well, who are the specialists serving the General Assembly?
Oh, I know that one. The Economic and Social Council.
Say, you girls are good.
Of course we are, George. The Economic and Social Council is that matchbox over there below the General Assembly. Who wants some coffee besides me?
Me.
Oh, I do.
Oh, now, that's better. Somebody ask me a question.
All right, Margaret. What's that matchbox over there?
Oh, Phil, don't you remember? That's the one your uncle gave you when he was here at...
Now, Margaret.
She's forgotten her own game.
What committee is that matchbox supposed to be?
Oh, of course, Phil. How stupid of me. Why, that's the one that settles cases like Judge Gafferty down the street.
You mean the International Court of Justice, don't you, Margaret?
Well, that's what I said, Duncan.
Well, that serves both the General Assembly and the Security Council, doesn't it?
Yes, in all questions involving legal decisions.
Well, how about the Security Council? The littlest matchbox on the table. Who knows about that?
Oh, that's to settle disputes that the General Assembly hasn't been able to adjust, as well as take action on any disputes if action is necessary.
Well, how many members on the Security Council?
11 in all. 5 permanent ones. The 5 great nations and 6 rotating ones.
Well, how do they vote?
They must have 7 out of 11, mustn't they?
That's right. But in voting on major disputes, which may or may not involve one or more of the great nations, the 5 permanent members must vote unanimously.
Well, I hadn't thought of this before, but it seems to me that last thing might cause trouble. Why, in our club, if the 5 top committee members all had to vote unanimously, we wouldn't get anything done.
I've thought about the same thing, too. Then there's something about the great nations having the power of veto on action taken against themselves, isn't there?
Yes, I was reading about that.
I've read a lot of things that sound pretty complicated, but the way I look at it is this. The Dumbarton Oaks proposals are just proposals that all the interested nations were given to consider.
You mean they're not final in any way?
Lord, no, Janet. They're just an outline for discussion, something to start on.
But they sound terribly definite somehow.
Oh, they don't, Alice. Why, it's just like a cookbook recipe. I'm always frightened to death when I try one, but then I find if I change a little bit here or a little bit there, I don't always get what the cookbook said, but I always get something good.
Oh, I know. And sometimes it's even better than the cookbook.
I don't know anything about recipes, but I think Phil is right. Dumbarton Oaks was a start. Now, the 46 interested nations have gathered together to discuss how to make a good start arrive at a good finish. There are bound to be some changes.
And a lot of details to be ironed out, big ones and little ones.
It's got to be flexible, but I'm still bothered about that veto business.
Oh, I wouldn't bother myself too much, Duncan. I'm sure it'll all get straightened out. Things always do if you give them time.
I suppose that so many suspicions have been created among the great powers in the last 25 years that, well, they're not quite prepared at this time to take part in a security league which might be used against them.
A good many of these suspicions were created by people like us.
Oh, I don't see how, George.
George means because we didn't know enough or care enough to find out what was going on. Isn't that it, George?
Yes. Phil, you remember that letter you and Margaret had from your boy, Jimmy? He said something about our having to know what nations were doing and taking our share of responsibility, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. Let me see if I have that letter here. Oh, yes, here it is. He says, we can never not know the countries of the world again. Those of us who will come back understand this and will make it our business to see that our country understands it. But you at home can and must do your share now. Dumbarton Oaks has given the world a chance. We must seize this chance, or all we are fighting for will be lost.
That's absolutely true. And it's vital that we do what Jimmy says. Recognize our responsibility, not for tomorrow, but right now.
In time, I feel that these suspicions between nations will disappear, and that real security will be achieved. Meanwhile, we must support an organization which is working to establish the machinery for world security.
Well, I'm sure if we do support it, it'll work out in time. I'm absolutely for it if that helps. And so is Philip, aren't you, dear?
Why, of course, Margaret. We all are. That's why we've been discussing it. But I do feel that we must realize that it cannot be arrived at all at once.
Or can we expect it to be perfect right from the start?
No, we certainly must not expect miracles.
Oh, no one ever expects miracles, Alice. That would be silly.
Oh, Margaret, you're wonderful. But, well, I'd like to ask a question seriously. Well, what are some of the details which you all think may be troublesome?
There'd be a good many, I guess. Things like boundaries, for instance.
Or the number of votes a republic or a confederation of states should have.
How to set up regions and regional committees.
And the handling of territories.
Let's have some more coffee, Phil. You make me dizzy when you go so fast in all these things.
That's a good idea, Margaret. But don't get dizzy. Just think about these questions. We can't answer them, perhaps, but we should know about them.
No, thank you. No more coffee for us, Philip. It's time George and I went home.
Well, we've got to go, too. I didn't know it was so late.
Well, when we get talking about Dumbarton Oaks in San Francisco, time just plain disappears.
That's right. It's so darn interesting, I feel we could go on all night. We'll meet again, shall we?
You
Yes,
bet.
George,
Let's
you like
go.
Wonderful idea.
And in the meantime, let's read all we can and listen to all we can. We can't learn too much.
We certainly can't. Well, so long, everybody.
Good night. Good night, Alice. Good night, Janet. Good night, George.
I agree with that, Mrs. Castles. We can't learn too much.
No, we can't, Mr. Child. The decisions being made today are so far-reaching that they touch every one of us and every person in the world. It is not only our serious responsibility, but our serious duty to learn all we possibly can and to give our carefully thought-out support to the establishing of a world organization for peace.
Mrs. Castles, the San Francisco Conference has nothing to do, really, with the actual peace itself now, has it?
No, it hasn't. The peace itself can be drawn up only after the fighting has ceased. The San Francisco Conference has to do solely with the establishing of the machinery for peace.
Which, after all, is the most important first step, isn't it?
Important and absolutely essential, Mr. Child, for on it depends the security and the future safety of all the peoples of the world. We must give this machinery our full support. Mr. Roosevelt ended the address he had planned to give at the Jefferson Day dinner with these words: "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith." President Truman is leading us forward in the same spirit. We must remember this and not let the doubts of today destroy the making of a safe and just and free world in the tomorrow which is so near at hand.
Thank you, Mrs. Castles. You just heard Mrs. John W. Castles, Jr. in the CDVO program News and Letters from Home and Abroad. We have a lot of information available on these subjects, and we'll be glad to send it to any of our radio audience or answer any inquiries you may have. CDVO had a list of services in need of volunteers, services in which you can do your part on the home front. Anyone wishing a copy of this list can write to this station, that is WNYC, Municipal Building, New York 7, New York, for care of News and Letters from Home and Abroad. The cast today included Glen Lincoln, Emily Newman, Rowena Clay, Leo Haas, Ted Fuld, Mike Mikuloff. The production was under the direction of Sarah Lutsky. Tune in at the same time next Friday for more letters and more news, and this is the Municipal Broadcasting System.